Hello! So, January was a really good reading month for me. I actually managed to finish 8 whole books, which I'm really happy with, and I think that the year is off to a great start. So I'm going to jump right into it, and the first book that I finished was The Amber Spyglass by Philip Pullman. This book was an audiobook read for me and also a reread for me. If you haven't seen it, I mentioned in my audiobook tips video, which I will link up here for you, that I am using audiobooks solely for rereading now, and this was probably the first series apart from Harry Potter that I reread on audio. This is book 3 in the His Dark Materials trilogy, and so I'm not going to tell you what this book is about, but book 1 follows a protagonist named Lyra, who is a young girl orphaned and raised at Jordan College, which is a university in Oxford, and she is not the prim academic lady that those who raise her at the college would like her to be. Actually, she behaves much like the other children in the area. Her best friend is the kitchen boy, and she and he enjoy having games and mud fights with the local Egyptian children, the Egyptians being the travellers in this world, and they travel through Oxford on occasion, and when they do, Lyra likes to get involved in lots of hijinks. And when her best friend is taken by some child snatchers named the Gobblers, and a woman named Mrs. Coulter comes into her life, she is whisked away from Jordan College and gets embroiled in all sorts of journeys and discoveries, and there's magic and adventure. It's very much a fantasy story. Lyra's Oxford is based on a sort of a Victorian England setting, and the story really evolves from there. That's really only touching the surface of what this trilogy is about. I read it originally when I was around 11 years old, so around the same age as our protagonist, and I really enjoyed it at the time and really enjoyed the story and the characters, and I wanted to reread it again now because I had heard that there was a lot of controversy about some of the themes in this series, which I didn't pick up on at the age of 11, but I very much did as my 27-year-old self, because there are a lot of quite heavy themes in this story, and I think the main reason that the trilogy was so controversial at the time, particularly around the time that the film The Golden Compass came out, which incidentally is the name of the first book over in America. Here it's The Northern Lights, and I don't actually understand why publishers change names in different regions, but there we go. And very much the religious head, the church in this instance, in this book is painted and is the antagonist of the series, and God is the antagonist of part of the series, and so I can completely understand why the series was so controversial. And there's also a lot of themes of growing up and discovery and all the things that go along with that. There's some amount of brutality in this, but it is quite subtle, so I didn't pick up on it when I was younger, but I certainly do now. And some of the themes are just quite heavy, and I don't necessarily have a problem with that in a novel like this, because it does make it so accessible to the young and the old or older, because it's a fun and enjoyable read for someone who is age 11, for example, and the darker themes are so subtly put that it's not necessarily so obvious to a younger reader, whereas it is to an older reader. So I really enjoyed this one. It is my favourite of the trilogy, I think, just because of how heavy some of the themes are. I wouldn't necessarily say that there are any trigger warnings in this series that I noticed. If you have issues with criticism of organised religion, then that might be a trigger for you in this series, but certainly only really comes up as a major plot point in this book. But I gave it 4 stars. I really enjoyed it, and I particularly enjoyed the audiobook reading experience, which I would highly recommend. The narrative elements are narrated by Philip Pullman himself, and then it's a full cast audiobook, so every character has their own voice. I mean, within reason, some of the actors act more than one character, but for the most part they're all individual voices, and I really enjoy that, and I think it also makes it particularly accessible for young listeners, so I would recommend this one to basically anyone. The next book that I read was Peace and Turmoil by Elliot Brooks, which I read as an ebook, so there will be a picture somewhere. I actually did a full review of this book, both on Goodreads and here on YouTube, so I will link the video up here somewhere and the Goodreads review down below, so I'm not going to go into any great detail here. This was a 5-star read for me without any doubt whatsoever. Absolutely fantastic epic fantasy story which follows a large cast of characters in a land called Abram, where there is lots of political manoeuvring going on and magic and mythical creatures, and it's really, really complex. As ever with epic fantasy, it's very difficult to tell you what the story is about without spoilers. It should be coming out in March. I don't have a release date for you yet, but as and when I do, I will try and put that in the description box for you. Elle from the channel, Elliot Brooks, she's the author, said on Instagram that she'll be releasing the release date soon, so keep your eyes peeled for that. I would highly, highly recommend picking it up, although even though the last book was suitable for all ages, I wouldn't say that Peace and Turmoil is. I think it's more of a adult book. Next up, I read Fire and Heist by Sarah Beth Durst, and this was the Fairy Loot book for the December box, and I read this book as part of the Fairy Loot read-along, and this follows a protagonist named Skye Hawkins, who is a wyvern, and a wyvern is essentially a were-dragon, and she is part of a family of wyverns in a community full of wyverns, and Skye gets involved in her very first heist, and there is a lot of self-discovery in this book. I really enjoyed it. It's a very quick and easy read. It's not particularly... Oh, I think I've put it away upside down. I have. I've put the dust jacket on upside down. That's helpful, isn't it? 292 pages. So it's not an especially long book. So it is quite fast-paced, which I liked. There's not massive amounts of world building, but it's not needed because it's urban fantasy, so it's set in our world. There is a lot of character building, which is nice, and there's dragons, and I like dragons. I gave this book 4 out of 5 stars. It was a fun time. The next book that I read was The Long Walk by Stephen King, writing as Richard Bachman, which was his pen name at the time. And this is a dystopian novel set in the future, in which once a year a race, if you can call it that, is held for 16-year-old boys to walk, and they have to walk at a constant speed of 4 miles an hour, I think. 4 miles an hour, and if they drop below 4 miles an hour they get a warning, and they get up to 3 warnings, and if after 3 warnings they haven't picked up the pace, then, well, there can only be one winner. Let's put it that way. It's relatively brutal. It's not as brutal as it could be. It's a little bit graphic, but not as graphic as it could be. It's a very meandering plot, so if that's not your thing, then bear that in mind. It's usually not my thing, but I actually really, really enjoyed this book, and I think the reason was that it was so atmospheric. so atmospheric. I really felt like I was there, and I felt physically tired while I was reading this book, because these boys are walking for miles and miles and miles without stopping. They can't stop to go to the toilet, they can't stop to eat, they can't stop to sleep, nothing. They have to keep going, and the person who wins the race wins whatever they want for the rest of their lives. And I mean, there's not a lot of backstory in this, so if you want to know why the race is happening and what the point of it is, it doesn't necessarily address that, and I'm mentioning that, which is potentially a minor spoiler, but not really. But I mention it because I know that could really bother some people. It didn't actually bother me, and I would have thought that it would, but actually I was willing to look past that because I really, really enjoyed this book, and I had sort of apprehension before going into it, but 100% was worth it. I read it in a weekend. It was so good. And I mean, it's not long. It's not a long book. It's 389 pages, so it's totally reasonable to have read this in a weekend, but I would 100% recommend it. I haven't ever read any Stephen King before, and I probably won't read any more after this because I know that he mostly writes horror, and I'm a wimp, so that's not really my thing. But I really wanted to read this one. I heard about it from Emily from the channel Books with Emily Fox, and yeah, I would highly recommend it. I really, really enjoyed it, particularly how atmospheric it was. It was fantastic for making you feel really immersed. I gave this one 4 stars. The next book I read was also an ebook, so picture, and unfortunately this was not a positive experience. I actually started on the 12th of December 2018 and I didn't finish it until the 14th of January, and that's because it was a slog, and it was The Near Witch by Victoria Schwab. I read this book as part of my Schwabathon that I am still running with my lovely friend Nisha from the channel On the Margins Of. We've actually extended the readathon to the end of March to allow ourselves to fully experience all of Schwab's works. The Near Witch was Victoria Schwab's first published novel, and it's actually been out of publication for a little while, but it's actually being republished again this spring, I think, and I understand that it's been tidied up a bit, but I don't think that it's gone through a vigorous edit, which is a shame because this was actually a 1-star read for me, and I hate to say that because I don't think I've ever given a book 1 star before. 1 star for me means that I disliked it. 2 stars is like I didn't like it, I didn't care for it. 3 is good, 4 is great, 5 is fantastic, and 0 is I didn't want to rate it for some specific reason, like I didn't rate a couple of the non-fiction books that I read last year because I didn't really feel like I could. But 1 means that I disliked it, potentially even hated it. I'll tell you what the story is about first. The Near Witch is set in a provincial town. It's a fantastical world, it's a fantasy story, and we follow a main character named Lexi in a town of very close-minded individuals. It's all the same people live there, and when an outsider comes into the town and children start going missing, there is a sort of manhunt to find out who is kidnapping children. And then there's a fantastical element to it, which I won't go into because spoilers. The first, I would say 60-70% of this book was just meh for me, to be honest. It was really slow. There wasn't an awful lot of world building. There wasn't an awful lot of character development. For me, it was trying to be really whimsical, but not really pulling that off. And I don't think it needed to be whimsical. I think Schwab was just getting started in trying to create this sort of dark feeling to her books, but hadn't really allowed herself to fully explore that, and that's something that she really pulls off in some of her other works, and I think that's because since The Near Witch she's allowed herself to go to that dark place, whereas I think she was still trying to make The Near Witch quite whimsical when it didn't really need to be, in my opinion. So the first 60-70% of the book fell really flat for me, and if it had carried on in that way, it probably would have been a 2-star read for me. And if the ending had been good, it may have made it to a 3-star. But unfortunately, I absolutely hated the ending, and I can't really tell you why because it's spoilers. But honestly, it made me so angry. The ending just really spoiled it for me, and there were a lot of themes going on in this book that I really disliked, and a lot of things that were handled in a way that I really disliked, and for that reason it was a 1-star for me. I don't really want to go into too much detail because anything that I say and any of the reasons I give could potentially be spoilers, but I think that some of our characters were very closed-minded with no real reason to be, and some of our characters were just being stubborn with no real reason to be. The ending didn't have too much of a point to it for me, and I felt that it was extremely anticlimactic, and there was a trope in this that I hated, which was very, not quite insta-lovey, but nearly insta-lovey, and I just really didn't enjoy it. I can enjoy insta-love if it's done well, but I just don't feel like it was done particularly well in this book, and it's a real shame. It just didn't work for me for a number of reasons, and unfortunately it was a 1-star read. On to a lighter note, the next book that I read was The Queen of the Tearling by Erica Johansson, which is the first book in the, I think it's called The Queen of the Tearling series, I'm not sure. This was a 4-star read for me, so much better. I really enjoyed this one. This book follows Kelsey, who is the heir to the throne of a land called Tyr, and she is raised by her foster parents to become the queen when she comes of age, and when she comes of age, the Queen's Guard come to collect her from the cottage that she's been hiding in throughout her life to take her back to the city, New London, to take the throne. And almost immediately upon leaving the cottage, she is chased by, sorry if you can hear rustling, that's Haruki, or is it Shinji having a play? Anyway, almost immediately upon leaving the cottage, there are people trying to kill her. So there's quite a lot of action out of the gate, but then the majority of the book is sort of dealing with the political issues that have arisen in her absence, and Kelsey really finding herself and finding her way as a queen. I did enjoy this one. I've actually since finished book 2 and I'm currently reading book 3, which I'll talk about in later wrap-up videos, but I will say for now that I really enjoyed book 2 even more. But the reason I bring that up is because there are some sort of trigger warnings that go along with this book, but they are much more prevalent in book 2. So whilst this book might not be too triggering, I think if you were to continue with the series they might be. So I want to let you know that there is sexual violence in these books. There is also some graphic violence, more graphic violence in this book than in book 2, but the sexual violence really amps up in book 2, so that's something to be aware of before picking this series up, because it's not so prevalent in book 1. It's definitely there in book 1, but more so in book 2, so I just wanted to make you aware of that. But aside from that, and it isn't needlessly used, and it is appropriately addressed at an appropriate point of the story, and it is an important part of the story and something that the author takes very seriously. Book 1 is quite a lot of setup, but I really still enjoyed it. I think the growth of our main character and some of the side characters was really well done. It's got a lot of depth. I can't really tell you too much about the type of novel this is. I think it's quite a mishmash of different genres. It's definitely fantasy, but in terms of subgenre, anything I tell you could potentially be spoilers, so I won't. But I would recommend picking this series up. I wouldn't have necessarily said jump to it and put it right near the top of your list based on this book, but having read book 2, I would say that it's definitely worth being pretty high on your list. It's a really good series so far. The next book that I finished was another audiobook, and it was Warbreaker by Brandon Sanderson, which again was a reread for me. I read this book for the first time only last year, but I think I mentioned before that when I originally read this book, I was sort of rushing through it between the Mistborn trilogy and the Stormlight Archive because I was really keen to get to the Stormlight Archive, and I just read this because there'd been some reviews and things on the internet, and mostly on the subreddit, the Brandon Sanderson subreddit, that suggested that you should read Warbreaker first, and I am glad I did, but I think that my rushing through it slightly tarnished my appreciation of the story, and this was a 4-star read for me the first time I read it, and on audio this year I've given it 5 stars. It really is very good. In this book, which is currently a standalone but will eventually be part of a series, in this book we follow 2 sisters who are princesses and 1 god. And our 2 princesses, one is raised all her life to marry the God King, not our other character, a different character, and the other is raised with no real purpose and likes it that way. But then things get turned on their head, and the wrong sister is sent to marry the God King, and the sister who'd been preparing for that her whole life takes it upon herself to go and rescue her sister. So we follow those 2 characters, and we also follow a character called Lightsong, who, as I mentioned before, is a god, but he very much questions his godhood, doesn't think he should be a god, doesn't believe in his religion, and also is completely hilarious. The one problem I had with this book, and particularly the fact that I was reading it as an audiobook, was the fact that I looked like a crazy person laughing to myself in public all the time, because this book is very funny, and Lightsong in particular is very funny. I absolutely loved his character. Ciri, I absolutely loved her character. Vivenna, I didn't care for her the first time that I read the book, and I didn't care for her the second time I read the book either. She grows on you, and by the end of the book I do like her, but at the beginning she really irritates me. I find her quite whiny and judgmental, and those are not traits that I enjoy, because I used to be whiny and judgmental, and I try really, really hard in my life not to be, and she does try not to be, but she doesn't notice that she's doing it most of the time, and that's really realistic and really human, but it really annoyed me. This is a really, really interesting book. It's really funny. Like I said, it's a standalone, so it's a pretty good place to start with Sanderson, but a lot of people recommend this as a good first book of Sanderson's to read, and I don't necessarily agree, because the magic system in this book is very, very complicated, in my opinion. I think it's the most complicated magic system out of any of Sanderson's books that I've read, and on that basis I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. Mistborn is a good place to start, but if you don't want to start with a series, then I would suggest starting either, if you want Cosmere, then start with Elantris. If you're not bothered about Cosmere, then start with Skyward, which is his new sci-fi young adult book. Skyward is good because it gives you a flavour for his writing style, Brandon Sanderson's writing style, which is very specific and excellent in my opinion. You don't get as much of a flavour for that in Elantris because it was his first published work, and he hadn't come into himself quite as much, but the magic system in that book is a lot less complicated than in this one. And if you're used to epic fantasy and you're used to complicated magic systems, then by all means I would recommend starting with this one. It's a really fun one. But if you're just starting to get into epic fantasy and you're not overly familiar with magic systems, I wouldn't recommend starting here, because it is really complicated and it's not the norm for epic fantasy, I wouldn't say, for a magic system to be as complicated as it is in this book. And I'm really hoping that when he does expand this particular book into a series, that we will get a lot more information and in-depth understanding of the magic system in this one, because that is potentially my one criticism of this book, is that there isn't a lot of exploration of the magic system, but there are specific reasons for that, so I don't take any stars off the book for that reason. I can't tell you what the reasons are, but there are reasons. I'll leave that there. There is one book that I started in January that I wanted to discuss, and that is The Storm Crow by Kaylin Josephson. And this book was an advanced reader copy that was included in the December Fairy Loot box, and I started this. I got 64 pages in and then I put it down because it was sending me into a reading slump. Now this, I think it's a young adult, yeah, it's a young adult novel that follows two sisters, Anthea and Kalitza, who live in a kingdom that relies on elemental storm crows for pretty much all areas of their life. But when the elemental storm crows are destroyed by a neighbouring kingdom, it sends our protagonist Thea into a deep depression, and her sister come up with a plan to revive these elemental crows. Now that all sounds really, really interesting, and all that setup does happen in that portion that I read. So there wasn't really anything in the section that I read that I wasn't expecting. All of that is written on the back of the book, on the blurb, which isn't unusual. I mean, most novels, the blurb kind of summarises that first setup section, but I haven't officially DNF'd this book. I might still try and work my way through it because I'm still kind of interested to see where it's going to go, but so far it's been quite slow paced. I don't necessarily feel too connected to the characters, and one of the major themes in this is depression, which ordinarily I would quite like in a book, and the author has suffered from depression, so it's an own voices sort of story. Kind of. I mean, it's a fantasy novel, so not really, but she's using her own experience to portray depression, and I think her experience with depression must have been very different from mine, because the depression in this book is very in your face. It's a predominating factor of our protagonist's life, which depression is, but in my personal experience of depression, it's much more subtle, and I feel like it was far too in your face in this book, but I'm not going to write this book off just because of that. I think my main issue with this book has been the plot so far, because it has just, even though it's been a very slow start to the book, it also feels like the plot is jumping too many steps too quickly. It doesn't feel particularly natural. It sort of feels very convenient in places. So like I say, I'm not necessarily writing this one off. It might be that it appears in a wrap-up video in the future, but I did just want to mention it now because it is an advanced reader copy, and I said that I'd let you know my thoughts. So I'm mentioning it now just in case I don't finish it, and if I do officially DNF it, I will let you know. But what I'm planning to do is what I did with The Near Witch, just read chapter every now and then if and when the mood strikes, but that's where I am with this one at the moment, unfortunately. And the last book that I finished in January was Throne of Glass by Sarah J. Maas. And this is a book that has been on my TBR for a while, and which I've heard so many mixed things about, so many mixed things. Some people love it, some people hate it, basically, and I really enjoyed it, and I did give it 4 out of 5 stars. In this book, we follow a main character called Selena Sardothian, who is an assassin, but she's been caught, and she starts out the story in a prison camp, and she is offered an opportunity. She can win her freedom by competing in and winning a competition to become the king's champion. She takes up that offer, but there's a lot more going on than just a competition. Now, I've said it before and I will say it again, the tournament trope is one of my absolute favourites. I also love assassins, so this book had a lot of tick boxes on it already in terms of whether I was likely to like it or not. I really enjoyed it. I really did enjoy it. I really liked our main character Selena. I really enjoyed some of the side characters. I enjoyed the tournament trope. I enjoyed some of the other plot devices that were going on in this book, and I'm definitely going to be continuing with the series. Whether or not I fall into the love or hate camp for this series remains to be seen, because I think that people's enjoyment of the series, as I've heard it, drops off a little bit later on, not necessarily in this particular book. But I really enjoyed it. I'm really looking forward to reading the rest of the series. I think the pacing was great, the character development was enjoyable, the plot was interesting, and there are plenty of places that this story can go, so I can kind of see why the series is so long. And that's it. Those are all the books that I read in the month of January. Here's hoping that February will be just as good of a reading month. And that's it for now. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video and want to see more like this from me, then do think about hitting that subscribe button. I'd be so grateful. And I hope to see you again soon. Thanks. Bye.